Hello and welcome back to the Japan Politics Podcast, and this week I want to talk about the early start to Sanae Takaichi's time as Japan's new Prime Minister and the first ever female Prime Minister of Japan, and how she seems to be enjoying a bit of a good early start, a bit of a honeymoon period, and why everyone seems to fairly approve of her in the main. Now, that's mainly been expressed in terms of polls and favourable poll ratings. Now, her cabinet have fairly good polls, higher than those enjoyed by Ishiba's cabinet, her predecessor, I believe. And she's also personally enjoying better approval ratings than Ishiba. She's got approval ratings I've seen in the 60s, in the 70s, in a bit of a range, which is all better than Ishiba, I believe. And in one particular poll, which had a bit of a high watermark moment, she had, I believe, around 83% approval, which is incredibly positive. Now, you might well imagine that it's possible over time this might level out and she won't, perhaps, as she encounters difficulties in the future, enjoy such a high poll rating, but it's certainly a very good early positive start for her. In particular, she enjoys quite good youth support, according to some polls I've seen, which has always been a little bit of a difficult issue for the LDP. And I believe, according to one poll, she had around 80% approval from people aged 18 to 39. So that's a very, very positive sign for Sanae Takaichi. The question of why is interesting. Obviously, normally most politicians get some sort of early bounce. Although it's particularly interesting in Sanae's case because she wasn't the expected candidate, the favourite candidate to get in and win. It was sort of widely thought that Koizumi was seen more as a frontrunner who would get in, and so her getting in was a little bit of a surprise. But it's interesting she's still seen a little bit of a positive early reception in terms of the polls. It could be that maybe people are responding to sort of her brand of, sort of strong, more conservative values. But on the other hand, those values are sort of quite aligned with Shinzo Abe and the Abe faction, and that faction was strongly associated with the scandals in terms of the finances, the slush fund scandal of the LDP, and the church scandal, both of which have really put the LDP in this difficult position they are now, where they began first losing popularity and have ultimately led them, at least in part, to lose their majorities in the upper and lower house under Ishiba. Although, interestingly, Ishiba ran as a reformist candidate sort of outside of the Abe faction when he lost them those majorities, whereas now Shinzo Abe's successor, effectively, a person who he endorsed in the past, Sanae Takaichi, has come back to lead them, and she's now enjoying quite good polls. It could be perhaps that, of course, Shinzo Abe won elections. Many people like Shinzo Abe, and like I say, he was in power for a very long time, so perhaps people are sort of beginning to already look nostalgically back to that time, despite the scandals associated with his faction, the Abe faction of the LDP. Perhaps they're longing back to that sort of more stable period, and they're hoping that Sanae will provide sort of more strong leadership, given the succession of short-lived successors and prime ministers who haven't lasted very long, and the relative uncertainty sort of post-Abe. It's also interesting to think that she's got in after a sort of period of brief uncertainty where it looked like the opposition coalition might form to stop her becoming Prime Minister, but she's got in as Prime Minister with the support of Ishin, a fellow Conservative party. So I wonder if maybe bringing them in has sort of maybe given her a small boost, or get the cabinet a small boost in approval from Ishin supporters. Maybe that's something of a factor in her getting these high approval ratings. Or it could be perhaps that Ishin have a sort of 12 demands they've made of the LDP as a prerequisite for joining them in coalition, and among those was campaign finance reform. So it'd be interesting to think that although she's from the Abe faction, that, as I say, is sort of affected by these scandals, maybe they think because the public at large think that because they're associated with Ishin who have these demands, maybe they think, okay, we get a strong leader, but also maybe she'll be, because of Ishin, have to make some sort of reform to sort of clean up politics and move away from those scandals and bring in campaign finance reform. Perhaps that's some sort of factor as well. It's interesting to think. So I'd like to now go over some of the sort of successes or the things that have gone fairly well for Sanae Takaichi early in her reign, and that perhaps have maybe contributed to her getting fairly good approval ratings. The first is the meeting with Trump. That seems to have gone over very well. Unlike Ishiba, who had to wait a while and sort of worry about when he'd be able to meet Trump, the meeting with Trump, I believe, was already pre-arranged. And seems to have gone over fairly well. He had some fairly complimentary things to say about Sanae Takaichi. He said that they he expected them to have a fantastic relationship. And as I say, he was generally quite complimentary when meeting her. And perhaps Sanae Takaichi is seen as a more natural ally for Trump. I mean, she's of, as I say, the Abe faction. Famously, Shinzo Abe and Trump had a very, close relationship, and Trump still references Abe and, considers him a friend, refers to him as a good friend when he talks about him. He's also met with Abe's widow, I believe. So he maintains sort of fond feelings for him. So perhaps maybe a successor who comes from the Abe faction and is seen as maybe more of a conservative than Ishiba was, or sort of more from the further right of the LDP. Maybe she might make for more of a natural ally for Trump. And I believe there was even a rumour floated when Ishiba was sort of struggling to arrange a meeting that Sanae Takaichi was offered the chance to meet Trump before Ishiba was, but she turned it down because she thought it would be improper to meet Trump. That's something I read anyway, so it certainly seemed for a long time that perhaps Sanae Takaichi might be a more natural ally for Trump, and so perhaps it's reassuring on the whole for the people of Japan, given the sort of the anxieties from Trump putting tariffs on Japan and sort of the lingering uncertainty of whether those tariffs will come back, despite Ishiba ultimately making a new trade deal with Trump towards the end of his tenure. Perhaps it's quite reassuring to see them get along quite well, and perhaps Sanae Takaichi is a more natural ally. Maybe that alleviates the fears that these tariffs might come back, and it sort of perhaps ordains that there might be a sort of a fairly positive relationship now between the two leaders, given that America is of course such a big trade and security ally for Japan. That's quite an important consideration. South Korea also appears to have gone over fairly well. Sanae Takaichi went out and met the leader of South Korea. Now he, in the past, before he became the president of South Korea, made some comments about the relationship Japan has with their history in World War II. And I believe he's criticised, for example, things like the accuracy of World War II and how it's covered in Japanese textbooks, and maybe sort of the full war crimes aren't considered, aren't portrayed in their full and portrayed entirely accurately, and it's sort of maybe not fully spelled out in Japanese textbooks is something that the president of South Korea has sort of accused Japan of in the past, and maybe not be as forthcoming about their past as they could be. Whereas Sanae Takaichi has regularly visited the controversial shrine which holds Class A war criminals. She went there regularly prior to becoming the new Prime Minister of Japan. And she's also in the past said things that you would consider fairly revisionist in terms of the history of Japan and World War II and sort of the war crimes committed during that period, saying, for example, that some things may have been exaggerated or, words to that effect. So it's been speculated that even before these two became the leaders of South Korea and Japan, that might lead, if they were to become the respected leaders, create sort of quite a tense relationship really, and be sort of quite awkward given the stances the two have taken and sort of the gap in understanding there. However, it appears that the meeting went quite well. Nothing of that sort of controversy went up. It was all smiles really from the president of South Korea. So it seems to have gone fairly well. And the two leaders agreed to strengthen ties. And given that this is such an important relationship between South Korea and Japan, that's quite a positive. And so maybe those two meeting and that going so well has alleviated some concerns in that respect. But that meeting seems to have gone over fairly well, as I say. Now on to things that are arguably been a little bit less positive in terms of the early start to Sanae Takaichi's time as Prime Minister of Japan. There's China. Now, recently, Sanae Takaichi perhaps drew a bit of ire by making comments about Taiwan, and she said that if Taiwan were to be attacked, or if there were direct action by China towards Taiwan, she would consider that an existential threat to Japan as well. Now, that appears to have not been taken very well in some quarters in China, and a Chinese diplomat posted as a consul general in Japan made some very sort of controversial comments in sort of quite violent language, sort of effectively threatening Sanae Takaichi. That led to a bit of controversy before he had to delete those comments. Now, you could argue in some ways this is maybe helped Sanae Takaichi a little bit, because it's sort of a Chinese diplomat directly threatening the leader of Japan allows her to, if she wanted to, double down on her Taiwan position. And you could argue it makes it a bit awkward for those both within the LDP and in the opposition parties opposed to the LDP, who would favour maybe more of a diplomatic approach to the Taiwan question and to China, and who would maybe want her to be a bit more diplomatic and not say such things, and just to be more open and conciliatory towards China. That makes it then a bit awkward for those people who think that way, because, well, if you come out and say that now, you sort of have to deal with the fact that China's sort of or at least their representative, a diplomat of China, has now threatened your leader. So that makes, holding that position, arguing it vocally, very awkward, and it sort of hands a little bit of a moral high ground to Sanae Takaichi if she wants to sort of double down now on the issue of defending Taiwan. You could argue that perhaps makes her appeal, sort of stronger, and sort of like she hasn't been intimidated and she's not backing down if she continues to maintain that stance. So arguably, sort of, if she wanted to continue that stance, it sort of maybe helps her out a little bit and gives her a little bit of cover to appear strong, as opposed to just provoking China for the sake of provoking China. Nonetheless, though, you would have to say China is a very important relationship for Japan, and a major world power. So you can't really regard this whole episode as a wholly good thing, given it's such an important relationship. And you would say that this sort of back and forth of words makes things a little bit more fraught, and a little bit more difficult to manage now. So in that sense, you have to perceive this situation as a negative. Onwards to the rice crisis gripping Japan. Now, this has been ongoing for quite some time, sort of the lack of availability of rice, and the unaffordably and the higher price of the rice that is available in the shops. This has been a continuing issue for the LDP, so the fact that it's even still a major issue and something under discussion is a negative in that sense. However, Sanae Takaichi has come up with a new approach, or the Japanese government has, which is to issue rice vouchers. Now, in some ways, you could argue maybe that's a good thing, in that at least it shows they're acting, and it sort of gives Japanese citizens, although they have to grapple with a lack of availability and higher prices of rice, at least it gives them tangible evidence in their hands when they hold these vouchers that the government is actually doing something. And much like how when Koizumi, when he was the farming minister, and he sort of released the older stockpiles of rice and sort of appeared and sort of strongly associated himself with eating older rice, saying it tasted just as good. He sort of very closely associated himself with this older rice and releasing the stockpile. So maybe in a similar way, Sanae Takaichi is associating herself with this new voucher program. So maybe that will help her, although obviously on the whole it's not good that there's this continuing rice crisis, but it looks like it's not going away immediately. So at least she can be seen to be acting and doing something and handing out these vouchers as a form of subsidy and to alleviate the financial pressure it's sort of placing on ordinary Japanese families. So in that respect, at least she's seen to be doing something, and that's somewhat of a positive even in a negative situation. And a final arguable negative they're facing is the difficulty of getting legislation through. Now, they have a coalition, of course, Ishin and LDP, which gives them, I believe, 231 seats, or something like that. So just shy of the 233 you need for an absolute majority. But nonetheless, they now have to navigate the contentious issue of reducing the overall number of seats in Japan's parliament by about 10%. Now, obviously, that means every party is going to be losing seats in one manner or another. So that's going to be very contentious, and many people won't want that. And so that's going to be quite difficult for them. Already, the Secretary General of the LDP has been said that this is a difficult issue, and they need to sort of gain wide understanding from the opposition in order to get this through. And he sort of acknowledged the fact that this could sort of effectively be difficult to manage and to get through, and that it's going to be difficult for all parties to agree on this. So there's already some concerns that, given the fairly narrow majority, as I say, technically they're two seats short, Ishin and LDP, and who knows, perhaps there might even be some within the LDP or Ishin that are sort of concerned about this. I can't speak to that, and that if the opposition parties are worried about this as well, or sort of they're struggling to get their understanding on this, they could find it difficult to get through then. And the Ishin sort of co-leaders have already come out and commented on this. The Ishin co-leader has said that calling an early election might be possible if they're not able to get it through and pass the opposition, which I believe Sanae Takaichi might well not want to call an early election. You'd think she would want, given the negative example that Ishiba had when he called an early election not long after becoming the LDP leader, and then he lost the LDP's majority in the lower house. That's quite a negative example, and you'd think that Sanae Takaichi would really want to, sort of really time her moment and call an election when she felt quite good at the chance of getting her majority back, or at least doing fairly well in the election. Given that negative recent example. And although she is, as I say, enjoying a bit of a honeymoon period and is doing well in the polls at the moment compared to her predecessor, you'd think she was still like some sort of major success to point to when running a campaign. And frankly, in an election campaign, you never know what's going to happen by the end of it. So she might be a little bit daunted by the prospect of already having to face an early election to get this legislation through. However, if she was hoping that perhaps that maybe Ishin might sort of sit on this demand for a little bit while she dealt with other priorities, she's had a bit of a discouragement. And it does seem that this demand for a 10% reduction was one of the top of the 12 demands that Ishin wanted. It was one of the most reported in the media anyway. And the Ishin leader has sort of arguably piled the pressure on a little bit, because he said that the trust he has in the LDP and that sort of their effectively, not to put words in his mouth, but their ongoing relationship, you could argue. But anyway, he said the trust depends on the bill going to Parliament in this current session. So this is something she can't really kick into the long grass for too long. I suppose she can sort of maybe say she's looking to gain understanding, gain opposition consensus on this, and sort of engage with the opposition parties. But ultimately, they expect this to go through in this current Parliament session, so she really can't delay it too long. She needs to sort of be looking at how she can approach this and hope to pass it if she's going to continue to get Ishin support, really. So that gives you hopefully a bit of an overview of some of the issues that have sort of come across Sanae Takaichi's desk, and sort of the early difficulties and the early successes she's had. But as I say, it appears to be, on the most part, going relatively well for her. She's had some difficult continuing issues she has to face, but she has had some early successes and enjoys a pretty good poll rating. And it'll be interesting to see how long she's able to continue that, if she's able to build on that success to get legislation through and get some achievements as she looks to perhaps the next election, and just how long this run of good luck and the honeymoon period continues. But yeah, this has been the Japan Politics Podcast, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Sayonara, goodbye.